Hello, everyone. I am Bogdan Maheros, and I am a co-host of the Power BI on Air sessions. Power BI on Air is the community where you can find people with interest in learning Power BI, sharing knowledge with others. And today we are glad to start our first session, and the session is about Power BI administration.
Hi all, my name is Taras Azarkiv and I'm co-host of the Power BI on Air session as well. Let me introduce our outstanding speaker. This is Melissa Coates, owner of Coates Data Strategies, Microsoft Data Platform MVP, data architect with solid background and in data warehousing and business intelligence. I believe you will enjoy this session as well. Just for one more note from our side, you can drop your question using chat in our YouTube channel. And we will discuss this question in our Q&A session. It seems to me this is time to start our first performance on Power BI on Air. Melissa, we can start.
Sounds good. Well, thanks for having me, everybody. So we are here to talk about Power BI administration. My goals for this session are how your role might vary based on the kinds of approaches being used in your organization. We're going to do a pretty fast run through of the variety of types of activities and responsibilities that you might be involved with. And then we're going to end with some suggestions for next steps based on where you might be currently. So this is how our agenda is going to flow since we have an hour. As you can imagine, each one of these sections is only going to be a few minutes each. And then we're going to have, if I stay on schedule, we will have about 15 minutes at the end to do some different Q&A. So they're going to be nice enough to watch the Q&A panel for me, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. If you'd like to have a copy of these materials, you can go download the slides right now from my website there on the presentations page. And you're also about to see a diagram in another moment, and that's on the diagrams page. Both are underneath the community resources section. All right, so here we go. This is what I call my end-to-end Power BI diagram. And the reason that I'm bringing this up, I'm not going to review it in depth, but the reason that I'm bringing it up is because Power BI is a really broad set of tools and it integrates with a lot of different things. So when someone says Power BI to you, what do they mean? Do they mean the service? Do they mean desktop? Do they mean the ecosystem as a whole? So if you're not extremely familiar with Power BI at this point, really, I just want you to know it's more than just a reporting tool. It's big, and that's why we need to give it attention to management, governance, security, etc. Now, the other thing that we have going on here is that where does administration actually start and end? There's an awful lot of overlap. And so depending on the size of your company, how staffing is structured, as an administrator, you might get involved with every single one of these things, or you might be focused on more of a sliver of these things. Now, with respect to deploying BI in a company, there's generally thought to be these three types of approaches. And if you're doing more business-led self-service BI, the business folks are generally responsible for nearly everything. And if you're doing on the far right, corporate BI, well, a central team might be responsible for, if not everything, most things. And then we've got the sweet spot in the middle where things are divided up based on who has skills and so forth. And so the thing is that all three of these are going to exist at once in your organization. It could differ by project, it could be different by your organizational group, but chances are you're going to have all three. The other thing that you're going to have all three of is this notion of how wide of something is. Is it organizational, team, or personal BI? And so you need more or less oversight depending on the depth of how many people your particular solution impacts. And depending on what it is, you might have more or less flexibility and agility. So for instance, corporate BI on the far right usually has formal change management, formal deployment processes, where on the far left, a personal BI solution, someone's just going to go change it, hit save and publish. So a lot of these things are going to impact the level of administration and the level of oversight. Not to mention, there's a ton of different factors inside your org, right? What's the maturity level of data management that differs by organizations and even within departments of organizations? And what's your data culture? Gosh, we could talk about this for the whole hour if we really wanted to. And then external factors. What kind of compliance and regulatory items do you have to meet? And that's going to end up influencing a lot of your administrative approaches that you take. So having said all that, who is allowed to be a Power BI administrator? And there's this tussle, right? We want to allow people to get things done, but we want to minimize risk. So generally speaking, the advice is let's assign that Power BI administrator role to as few people as possible. And that's because it's so very highly privileged. And because an administrator can go into workspace management and give themselves access to any workspace in the tenant, that means theoretically any data in the entire tenant could be made available to that administrator. So we tend to think it's a very high privileged role. So for that reason, it's also important to audit security changes that happen, including the ones an administrator makes, and what justifications there are for that and so forth. So I just said how, we want to reduce the number of administrators, but people have to get things done. So one of the ways that we can reduce the number of administrators is using PIM, or Privileged Identity Management. And that's part of Azure Active Directory. And it's basically kind of a just-in-time access for this kind of role. So here's how it works. An Azure administrator is going to say which roles are eligible for PIM. So in our case, we're saying the Power BI administrator role. This is also really good for the global administrator role too. Then a user says, well, I know that I'm eligible. I want to request that you activate it right now. And it'll get activated for 4 hours, 8 hours, something like that. And then optionally, you can have someone approve that before Mr. User actually gets to go in and do what he needs to do. When he gets notified that he's become a member of that role, he does what he needs to do. This could be updating a tenant setting, that sort of thing. Then at the end of that, say 4-hour time block, they're automatically removed from the role. So this means we can have less people that are just 24/7 sitting in there in the administrator role, which reduces risk because those elevated permissions fundamentally represent risk. And this also simplifies things because a lot of companies have that second admin account, right? You do all your normal work as you, and then you have a second admin account. This kind of thing can reduce the need for 2 different admin accounts. Now, this role that I'm speaking of, that we would do that just-in-time kind of access, it's a Microsoft 365 admin role, and it's called Power BI Administrator. So what happens is that the global administrator automatically is a Power BI administrator. But if we want to give someone less than global admin, which is always good, right? We basically assign users to that role. And at this point in time, we can only assign users to the role. I think Exchange allows some groups, but currently these are still managed by users. However, I propose that a male-enabled security group for your Power BI administrators, in addition to this role, is a good thing to have for several reasons. One is literally managing Power BI itself. You're going to have reports and that sort of thing in Power BI to help manage Power BI, and you can use that security group for your workspace permissions. You can also use that for certain tenant settings. So which capabilities are you going to allow for certain things? Because just because an administrator can edit tenant settings, some of the functionality, you actually have to be part of the group that's allowed permission to do that activity as well. And then there's also some service notifications inside of the tenant settings that we can line up to that too. We can set up some alerts here too, and I'm going to give you a specific example of that here in a moment. And then just, general miscellaneous communications and that sort of thing. So unfortunately right now it's 2 things to manage, but I think you get a lot of mileage out of having both of them in place at once. Now, when we say Power BI Administrator, what are we talking about? A lot of times people are referring to the Power BI Service Administrator when they just use sort of that generic term. But there's the Data Gateway Administrator, a Premium Capacity Administrator. There's a Workspace Administrator too, which, although it's part of the security name, I don't think of it as an administrator in that same, it's not the same sense, right? Because users that create a workspace, they're a member of this particular role. So we have a number of different options here and another number of different roles. We also have a whole lot of responsibilities. This is not a complete list, but it's some of the most common ones. And you can see that some of them are very, very big on their own, like auditing and monitoring, or like data delivery that may or may not be under your purview or not. And then in addition to your Power BI responsibilities, there's a whole bunch of other administrators that you're going to have to borrow from time to time. And some of these that might also be you. And some of them might be that you need to work with another person. So it gets to be a lot. So let's start with the Power BI service. Tenant settings, it's a good place to start. They are very, very important. And the first thing that I would like you to start doing, if you're not already with your tenant settings, is to document the decisions that are made. And maybe that's just you've been told X, Y, Z, and that's how it's going to be. Or maybe you were able to make the decision on your own because you know how things are done at your company. But what we don't want is administrators just making decisions on the fly, having documented decisions that we can go back to and use for transparency. And the reason for that is I also want you to document these settings for your user population. So for instance, if something like push apps to end users isn't working for someone, well, is that because they're not in the group that's allowed to do that? So if you have that documented for your user population, then they know, oh, this is the group that controls it, and this is how I go and request permission. Then the other thing that you can do is in the activity log, which we're going to talk more about here in just a few minutes, there is a activity, it's called Updated Admin Feature Switch, that you can track. This is when changes to the tenant settings occur. And then, in addition to tracking that from a auditing perspective, I also want you to think about setting up an alert to know very quickly something happened to my tenant settings. And I'm actually going to do a blog post and a video on this in the next few days, I think, because I don't think this is commonly known that we can alert on this. So there's 2 different places we can do this, but my favorite place is in Cloud App Security. If you hear any funny noises, there's a couple of bulldogs behind me that have decided to do a little playing. So that's the noise you might hear. Anyways, in Cloud App Security, we have policies that we can set up. And this one here, I have an activity that I'm saying if the app is Power BI, and if an administrative activity is true, send me an alert down here to this email. I can also do things like a flow and that sort of thing. And there's more on this page. I kind of simplified it just to get the screenshot nicely on the page. So then we end up receiving an email that says, well, this particular activity, in this case, I changed the allowed to print feature, and I set it from false to true. Now, a couple things to know. These kinds of things don't hit the audit log immediately either, so don't expect this email to be real time. But within a couple of hours, we would see that something happened to this setting and who made that change. So this is basically an extra alternative if you would like to be notified earlier than, say, you could get this data out of the activity log. Now, here's the caveat for both the activity log and the email alert. We don't know that the printing feature was officially false before. We just know that it was saved and it was saved as true. So we don't have a tracking of before and after. And if I changed who's in the groups allowed to use it, it's not like it tells me before there was 2 groups and now there's 3, right? So it's not that detailed. It's more just about something happens. We mentioned this before, that it's such a high privilege role, but management of workspaces in the admin center is a really important capability. We can also do some of this through PowerShell. But here's where we can view the metadata across the whole tenant. If we're talking about personal workspaces, by the way, we can't actually see the content. We can't actually update anything. But for the regular, they're not using the term app workspace anymore. So for the non-personal workspace, we can change the name if we need to. So let's say there's a preferred naming convention that we want to use and we need to adjust one. We can do that. We can adjust descriptions and we can adjust security access. So the admins, the contributors, the members, and the viewers. There's also the ability to manage embed codes in the admin center. So as you can imagine, since this relates to content that has been made available publicly, so this is that published to web feature, we want very, very few people to have access to this. And in the activity log, there is a specific activity that you can track there. And then you also get in the admin center this kind of tenant-wide view so that you can verify it on a regular basis, you know, maybe quarterly, that sort of thing, to make sure that, yep, all these things should still be made available and they are correct. Now, organizational visuals, this is one that can be a little bit confusing sometimes. So in Power BI Desktop, users can start using custom visuals, and that vastly expands the number of visuals that they can use and gives them way more flexibility for their display of data. So the first thing that I want you to consider doing is in your tenant settings, say we're only going to use certified visuals only. And that only takes effect in the Power BI service. And what that means is that anything from AppSource that is certified is allowed to be used. And what that does is Microsoft has reviewed it and made sure that, you know, there's not code injections, there's not data being transmitted back, etc. Now, to make sure that the same thing happens in Power BI Desktop, there's group policy setting that you can set. If you just Google group policy and certified visual, you'll find it. And that makes sure that desktop acts the same as service, which means people won't get frustrated and annoyed and angry when they publish up to Power BI service. So if we have it set to only certified visuals are allowed, what if there's an exception? So for instance, maybe we have purchased a custom visual from a vendor and it needs to send data back to call a machine learning algorithm, and that needs to communicate with their server. So it's not that it's not trustworthy, but it can't be certified in AppSource. That's where this organizational visuals really comes into play. Plus other things like, you know, maybe you've internally developed something and it's not from AppSource, but you want to make sure that it's available. Basically, when you manage things through this way, when you update it here, every user will get the update rather than if they're all trying to manage it through the independent files, which gets to be a mess really fast. We also have data flow settings. Now, things are changing here. So the big message that I want to say is just be really careful if you're doing a proof of concept right now. As with everything, it started out with very basic functionality, a minimally viable product, if you align with the MVP thinking, and it's improving and maturing over time. So there's some better integration on the release plan, but here's where we would hook up if you're using data flows and the data stored in your own specific data lake behind the scenes. Interestingly, featured content is also managed in the tenant settings of who's allowed to set something as featured. So that's kind of where admins can get involved a little bit. And so my thought is that featured content should be a little bit spare so that it's not, doesn't have a ton of things in it, and regularly review it, right? What if in the audit log, you haven't seen anybody run this thing in 4 months? That kind of thing. With regard to system health, there's a few different aspects here. So one at the top left is the regular Power BI support site. This is where they post something for broad public awareness. On the top right, we've got Azure status. So this could involve Power BI embedded, but you might also need this when you've got other services in Azure, right? Like the data lake storage, maybe cognitive services, machine learning, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, there is also the service health area in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And if something is important enough to hit this, that's where you're going to get the full-fledged root cause and impact analysis and all that kind of stuff. So that if something with your service level agreement with Microsoft is impacted, you kind of have the whole story. All right, so that moves us on to auditing and monitoring. And I am 2 minutes ahead of schedule, so life is good. All right, so why usage monitoring is critical? Lots and lots of reasons. So one, we want to find what's used the most. What if a data refresh schedule isn't as reliable as it should be? What if a report is shared from someone's My Workspace and it's suddenly getting hundreds of views per day? Change tracking. I want to know not only content changes, but security changes. And auditing. This usage monitoring data is invaluable for compliance. This stuff is gold. And so for security, by the way, you'll not only want to have this usage log data, so the transactions, if you will, but you'll also want to have a security snapshot at intervals. So for instance, a snapshot of workspace security every week. And then between that snapshot and these transactions, you've got the whole piece of the puzzle. It also helps us monitor our adoption efforts. So usage is a big part of adoption, but it's not the only part. It's a very important part though. And think about it this way though, more usage stats is not always positive. Do we always want more downloads? Or do we always want more data models? Even more reports isn't always good when perhaps the answer should have been smarter, more flexible reports. With regard to data trustworthiness, what percentage of our data sets are certified? And does that make sense based on some of those BI approaches that we talked about way at the beginning of this session? And license usage, when we couple that data with some data from Azure Active Directory, what if we have pro licenses that aren't being used? Or what if we have pro users that are only consuming content, and if we have the luxury of having premium, we can maybe adjust some things. Then we talk about usage patterns. And sometimes administrators don't really start thinking about truly understanding how users are using the system. But are too many exports happening, right? Are we using Power BI the way we want it to be used? What if there's a significant number of subscriptions happening? So email deliveries as opposed to dynamically viewed reports. Basically, what we're looking for is there's unmet needs or refactoring that could be happening. It can also help us find training opportunities. So what if someone's doing a lot of sharing from my workspace? Or what if you see lots of data sets published by the same author that could be duplicative? And that could maybe cause you to send an email that directs them to some training or some information about a better way to do it. What if you detected that the first time a newly licensed user has viewed or published content, and you turn around and send them a nice email about, hey, here's where our internal training or our documentation is. And finally, suspicious usage patterns. So things like, what if suddenly we're seeing a whole lot of data exports, right? Could we be concerned about someone about to leave the company and taking things with them because this is not the same usage pattern as they normally have? So having said that, this is what a Power BI usage auditing solution generally looks like. So in the middle, we have PowerShell scripts that are kind of the crux of the whole thing. And it gets data from the top left to the right. It gets data from our activity log, from the REST APIs, from Active Directory, and from our gateway logs. And then down at the bottom, we send that raw data somewhere so that the raw data is safe. We turn around and we prepare it so it's suitable for reporting and create our different reports to help us with adoption, security, auditing, et cetera. What's not depicted here on the release plan is integration with Azure Monitor. So we'll see how that changes things. I'm guessing that might only involve the audit log at the top left, so it would not negate the need for combining all of this data together to make it more useful. So it's important to know what your normal is. Otherwise, you don't know when something unusual is happening. And sometimes unusual is perfectly acceptable, and sometimes it's not. You also want to accumulate history. And if we can get up to 2 years worth of history to do trending, then I'm really happy to see how things change over time. And then I briefly mentioned this on the last screen, but that raw data that we get, we want to retain that. We don't want to throw it away. And we want to retain it in an immutable area where it can't be deleted and it can't be changed. And that does two things for us. One is, if that raw data, if you're pulling it out in just the straight JSON, the original JSON, which is what I recommend, if you missed parsing out a new attribute, so right now the activity log has somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 and some activities, 120-ish maybe. New ones get added all the time, right? So you can reparse that data if you need it, and you can also rely on it for formal auditing if you need to. So those of you that have strict compliance will know what I mean as far as that goes. And then correlate your data. So that diagram on the last page where we're bringing in Azure Active Directory and so forth. All data gets more valuable when we add in related data. So that improves its usefulness and how much we can do with it. Now there's 4 different ways that you can go after the usage monitoring data. I recommend starting with this guy right here, the Power BI activity log. It's the newest thing that's been released. It's 3-4 months ago now, somewhere in that range. It's a PowerShell module. Now be careful. There's an older PowerShell module that has a number of different problems with it. You don't want the old one. You want the new one, which is actually part of what we call the Power BI management module. And then it's called, I think it's get Power BI activity log, I think is the commandlet. There's also usage metrics in the portal, in the admin center. On the release plan, those are going to be improved. But for right now, we're kind of waiting for that to come. And then there's a couple other things that I'm not going to take the time to describe. There's a white paper called Planning a Power BI Enterprise Deployment. I've got a link for it at the end of this deck. I talked a little bit in that white paper about these 4 different items and, you know, the pros and cons, that sort of thing. So you can go there. Now, closely coupled with getting the data out of the activity log and all that good stuff is automation. And we basically have 2 different pieces to that we're usually using: PowerShell and the REST APIs. And granted, the REST APIs can be called from PowerShell, but bear with me a second. With PowerShell, we're focused on 2 different modules. And here I'm only focusing on the modules that are from Microsoft. There are great third-party and community items out there. But without getting into that, we have the management module and we have the data gateway module. And when we run these, from an administrator perspective, when you set the scope to organization, that means an admin can basically get the metadata for the entire tenant. And that's really helpful for things like getting a list of my workspaces and reports and so forth. Now, interestingly, there's a scope of an individual. So even if you're not an administrator and you're a technical user who just likes to code some PowerShell, you can absolutely use your own credentials and get information about what has published under your own permissions, or even do a little bit of automation on your own as well. The Power BI management module currently has 7 different modules, and there's lots of things we can do with it, right? The biggest one is the activity log data and getting lists of workspaces reports. I usually call that my tenant inventory. But there's a number of different things we can do with it. Now, the data gateway operations are separate. They're in a separate module. And that's been getting a lot of improvements here in recent months. So that's great. The big difference to know about with this module is it's only supported on PowerShell Core. And granted, I know we're all supposed to be starting to move that way, right? And away from Windows PowerShell. The management module is still supported on Windows PowerShell, but this data gateway module is not. Now, there's also the REST APIs. And the thing with this is that the REST APIs have more options than the management module. So if you can do something with a PowerShell commandlet, you can also do it with an API, but the inverse is not true. There's also less options for the APIs than you can do in the Power BI service. So hopefully we'll see more and more parity there. But at the moment, there's still some things you can only do in the user interface in the service. And then the other really interesting thing is, let's say you want to use the management module when you can, but there's an API you need to call that isn't in the management module. You can use them together. And a really interesting way to do that is maybe you really like to do authentication through the management module, and then you just call an API from it. And so we can do some things like that to use them together. There's also the aspect of managing user machines, which might be you and it might be an infrastructure team. But there's a few different pieces of software that users might need. The traditional Power BI desktop software that most users have is updated monthly for sure. That's the one where the big blog announcement comes out and everybody's tweeting excitement on Twitter and all that. There's also bug fixes throughout the month, which are, of course, fixed more quietly. The important thing here, though, is that regardless of which method you use, you might use System Center, you might use the Microsoft Store, whatever. If you can push it so that Power BI Desktop is updated as quickly as possible, that'll be the best experience. And I know there's some orgs that can't do certain things for certain reasons, but if 2 users need to share a PBIX file, they have to be on the same version. So it's important to get all this automated regardless of which way you go about it. And then there's a few other things that are generally commonly installed on user machines. So drivers are one. There's a provider for an Analyze in Excel feature that is used. There's also group policy settings. So that custom visuals one that we already mentioned earlier. There's another couple that are a little bit less common than that. And then if you have any custom connectors. So if somebody has developed one, for example. Okay, security. This section is by no means complete and thorough, but a few of the things to know is that all of your users of Power BI, with only a couple of exceptions, are going to need a free or a pro account so that identity management can be handled by Power BI. So for that reason, we are integrated with Azure Active Directory. So that concept or notion of user identity is critical. And if you follow stuff with Microsoft security, you'll know how protecting the identity is now the first goal, and the whole zero trust initiative from Microsoft. Now, the other things besides just managing users and groups that we can get from Azure Active Directory, there's a few really interesting things that can help us with Power BI. So multi-factor authentication is cool. Blocking unauthorized access, you know, that could be something that you're required to do in your organization. If so, it's probably already set up and not something you're worried about right now with the Power BI implementation. But the big one that I really like is you can only allow logins to Power BI from a certain AAD group if you need to manage it that way. So a variety of interesting things that you can do here. There's also a piece of Azure AD called Identity Governance, which has several things. So one of them is called Terms of Use. So maybe you need to ask users to acknowledge or agree to a data privacy policy, or maybe a data handling policy. And this is at least one way that you could do that. Access reviews are really interesting. So you've got group memberships, and you know, in the tenant settings, we might have a number of different groups that we have lined up to control some of the different features and functionalities. So basically, this gives you a way to find issues before the auditors do, and you can schedule a review monthly, quarterly, that sort of thing. And then whoever the reviewer is has to attest, yes, this is correct, or start booting some people out. And thirdly, we have that privileged identity management that we already talked about earlier with regard to minimizing who can be Power BI administrators, but you can use it for more than just that one purpose. We also have to be aware that a lot of permissions in a tool like Power BI are managed by the content authors themselves. So who can see dashboards and reports, who can access the workspace, who can view the apps. So a whole lot of them, I have a video on just this all by itself, but I mention it because it's not all controlled by an administrator, which means two big things. One is that there needs to be training and information available for people so they know what they should do. And then secondly, back to auditing, kind of a never-ending theme there. With regard to the gateway, there's several security-related aspects. So there is the administrators who is allowed to be in the Power BI gateway administrators, and that's on the individual gateway basis. Per individual data source, so let's say I've got 4 data sources mapped to one gateway, there are stored credentials there. So basically that's the identity that's querying the original data source. There's some new capabilities coming out though that are making that more flexible than it has been in the past. There's also user permissions, and by that I mean which users are allowed to use the data source, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. Can this data source use single sign-on? And then there's data privacy levels per data source, which controls if I'm mashing up data from two sources and I need to do some merging and it's more efficient to pass data from one data source to another, is it allowed to? And that data privacy level can get to be important for things like that. Now, beyond just, say, the Power BI service, there's permissions considerations way beyond that. So where's the source PBIX file being retained? Is it in, say, OneDrive or SharePoint that is secured the same as the published data out in the service? We want to make sure that those are safe as well, especially if data is imported, because that means there's data being stored in that file. How about source data files, Excel or flat files? Preferably, they're in a nice, auditable, securable location. But then how about things that we take out of the Power BI service? We have exports of data and reports or subscriptions that are sent to us, and those attachments. Where are those being saved? So instructing your user population on what to do there is recommended. So we also have data sensitivity labels. So here is kind of what it looks like in the Power BI service in a workspace if we've assigned labels to some of our different pieces of content. And there's a tenant setting that controls who's allowed to apply these labels. Most places, the users themselves are allowed to manage them themselves. From an administrative perspective, there's then a report in the admin center that kind of gives you an all-up view of, oh, here's how many pieces of content that we have aligned to the different labels. So in order to make this effective, so to speak, it's good for users to be well aware of if the sensitivity label is highly confidential or internal or whatever, what does that mean I can and cannot do? So it's good to have that in the description so that users see it in a tooltip, but it's also good to have it documented somewhere for reference as well, so that if someone does something that they shouldn't do, it was clear to begin with what was expected in that way. And then here's another really interesting thing that Cloud App Security is doing. So risky activities. These couple of previews, if you look at the first two items that are highlighted in yellow there, these are actually not policies set up by me, but they are user-generated policies, or system-generated, I'm sorry, that it just automatically detected something like, ooh, there's multiple sharing activities happening, or suspicious sharing happening, and that kind of thing. So those are really interesting. And what I did with mine is I went in there and I added an alert to it. So there, it can show you here within the Cloud App Security portal, or you can ask it, to send an email maybe to your security administrators or something like that. Finally, in the area of security, there's a number of different encryption keys to be aware of, and make sure that you're keeping them somewhere that is secure and available to your other co-administrators should they need to get at them. All right, so that moves us along to data gateways, and we're still right on time. I can't believe it. All right. We have two gateways. We have a personal mode and we have a standard mode, which used to be called enterprise mode, and I kind of liked that name better. But the idea here, usually from an administrator standpoint, we like to, if we can, and I know that the world isn't perfect, but we like to minimize the use of the personal gateway whenever we possibly can, because that's just running on someone's laptop, as opposed to that standard mode one where we are literally kind of defining the data sources and so forth. So what's happening here with that standard mode one is we have a number of different services. So you see Power BI service at the top left, But there's a whole bunch of different services that can share that same gateway from a communication standpoint. And then it basically goes through the cloud service and reaches down into your data sources. So the two big things to know is that although these different services can share the gateway, they don't currently share data sources. So you'd have to kind of maintain those, say, in Power Apps and in Power BI. And then there's also a data gateway that's associated with Azure Data Factory. And if you need that, stick that on a different server. Now, when is a data gateway needed? First, it's never needed when we're working in Power BI Desktop, but by the time it's the content has been published up to the service, we need it to refresh our data set or data flow, direct query, and live connection. And that data source is either on premises or in infrastructure as a service, that is an Azure VM, or a platform as a service type of item, like maybe a Azure SQL database, for instance, that's been added to a virtual network, in which case it acts as if it was in your data center. So I mention that because a lot of times people just say it's needed for on-prem, and with more and more companies adding boundaries around your cloud services, it's more complicated than just on-prem. And then there's an or. There's certain functionality that when you turn around and use it, it needs to go through a gateway. So know that as well, that occurs sometimes. I'm not going to go through this other than to say there's basically two main places that we manage gateways. One place is called the Power Platform Admin Center. The other area is in the Power BI service. And as you can see, it's, some things are in both and some things are in one or the other. There's also the gateway server itself, right? The actual server that sometimes we need to log on to and do something. And then there's some PowerShell commandlets that line up with some of these certain pieces. But just know, you got the Power Platform Admin Center for some things and the Power BI service for some things. One of the big things that we can do over in the Power Platform Admin Center is say, who's allowed to install a gateway? And so that's a really nice thing, so that if you don't want to allow anybody and everyone to just install a gateway somewhere, we can configure that here. Now, with regard to maintaining your gateway clusters, and by the way, the documentation online always says gateway cluster, even if there's just one server in it. But my recommendation is you should always have at least 2 gateway servers for your production cluster. And that does a few things for you. One is it eliminates that single point of failure. So if that machine has issues and it takes you a little while to swap it out, users won't go down with regard to their data refreshes and direct queries and so forth. It also lets you, when you're doing that gateway update, which comes out once a month, you don't necessarily have to get it installed every month, but you want to be fairly timely. But it lets you update machine number 1 while machine number 2 is still handling the traffic, and then you do the other one. So it eliminates any downtime when you're doing updates. And then just load balancing. So distributing the workload to help it handle the peaks and valleys. Now, in most customers that I've worked with, their dev test gateway cluster, it may have less servers added. So what this picture is trying to show here is that production has 3 servers and the dev test has 2 servers. And it also may have less resources, less RAM, less CPU, that kind of thing. That really just kind of depends on, how closely you need it to match production. But what I usually focus on for the dev test cluster is testing monthly updates, making sure we didn't break anything. And that's important because sometimes something goes wrong, but you should also actually have a handful of little audit reports so that after that dev cluster is updated, you can go and run a report that says, oh, okay, I need to refresh from X data source, or I need to do a direct query to this other data source, right? Just kind of run through your system tests to make sure all is still well before you move on to prod. Now, with regard to your gateway server specs, something that it took me a little while to actually realize is that the gateway does more than just connectivity. It does actual work. And the extent of the work that it does depends on how much work it can push to the source systems. But there are times when it actually has to run data merges and transformations right on that server. So your rules of thumb are direct query and live connection generally need more CPU. Data refresh generally needs more memory. And bandwidth is always important from a networking standpoint. So once clustering came around, we no longer set up one gateway server that's for just data refresh and one gateway server that's just for direct query. We let both types of communications go through the same gateway cluster, but we scale them up for resources and out for number of clusters to be able to handle both workloads. On the servers, you're going to want to set up the gateway server, so the Power BI on-premises data gateway software, any custom drivers that you might need. So basically, this kind of matches what any users have on their desktop. Make sure that it's also installed on the gateway server, or whatever they're trying to do later will fail. And then if there's any custom connectors that are necessary. One other item with regard to it being updated once per month, what you want to do is make sure that you keep the installer file from the previous month so that if you need to roll back easily, you can. And it's also helpful that you've got that installer file for, you know, exactly what you installed on dev if you're, say, up to 4 days later, for instance, ready to do the install on prod. Then you're not going and re-downloading it again. You're assured that you've got the same exact file. All right, so the other thing that I want to clarify, because this gets really confusing, is that a gateway cluster has administrators assigned to it, but data sources have users assigned to it. So the administrators are who can do things like add data sources, and add another machine to the cluster, etc. Users are which users can actually choose that data source and set up a refresh through it, for instance, that kind of thing. What makes it even more confusing is that the Power Platform Admin Center calls administrators users in their label at the top of the screen, and the PowerShell commandlet calls them cluster users. So kind of watch out for that as far as terminology goes. And then the last bit on the gateway that I'll mention is that a few months ago, there was some new log files that got introduced. When you enable them, which is done through a configuration file on the gateway server, it spits out 4 different log files, and you can configure some different things like the interval of how often it sends out information. But these are great. They're really, really good, and they make it a lot easier to grab some different health metrics and monitor activity and that sort of thing. So make sure you use these. They come out on the local server. I like to still write them to the local server and then pick up the files and move them to somewhere central where they'll be retained a little bit longer than they would be necessarily on the local gateway server. All right, our last section before we start to wrap up is premium. So why do we want to use premium, right? Well, it's cost effective when we have a whole lot of read-only users. That's why most bigger companies start to look at it. But then we've got a slew of features that start to open up with premium, right? Things like large data sets, for instance. It starts to open up things in the area of enterprise BI. So deployment pipelines that just came out to preview is a perfect example there. Things like paginated reports, that kind of thing. There's some compliance features. So if you really need isolated hardware that's located in a specific geography, for instance. It also opens up certain integration, the AI pieces, which are mostly hooked in with data flows at the moment. And then the hybrid cloud thing. So if you buy a premium SKU, they basically give you Power BI report server for the same number of cores. If you want to use it, it's totally optional. So there's two types of capacity. And I mention this because when people say the word premium, sometimes they're really just talking about capacity in general. And sometimes they literally mean a premium SKU. But we have premium SKUs and we have Power BI embedded SKUs. So premium we buy in the admin center, Power BI embedded we purchase from Azure. Power BI embedded basically is more designed to pause and scale and just do whatever we need with it. So it's a great way to test out features or use some premium features if you just don't need them 24/7. Now, when we're setting up our premium capacity, the first thing that we need to do is, well, purchase capacity, right? So let's say I have 32 cores. I need to set them up in the Power BI service. And so I might set up 3 of them in the Power BI service. So they don't have to be one-to-one with how you purchased them. And then each capacity, so you see I have capacity 1, 2, and 3 here. I would have administrators for each capacity. And I'd have workload assignments and settings for each capacity. And then each capacity gets multiple or one or more workspaces added to it. And for, with regard to those workloads, we have 4 workloads. So we have the AI workloads, data sets, data flows, and paginated reports. And with regard to when you purchase premium, right, you buy a purchase an amount of computing power. So monitoring and controlling this and using it wisely starts to be kind of a big deal. And so here's some of what those different specs are with the different nodes. But the other thing that you'll have to think about is, if I bought 32, so if I bought a P3, do I actually want to set it up as one single larger capacity, which will give you things like a larger model size and greater parallelism? Or do I instead value isolating some workloads and, starting to decentralize who my capacity admins are, right? There's kind of some give and take here with how you carve them up, so to speak, in the Power BI service. Monitoring health. So there's this app that they have for built-in reports. And then there's also now a template app that lets you connect to the data and create your own custom reports from that data that is exposed. So that's all really important to stay on top of. There's also now some email notifications. So outages or incidents is kind of a generic looking tenant setting. And that there's also now some nice capacity overload alerts that'll send you that, ruh-roh, things are in trouble that you need to address. And those overload alerts have just come out in the last few weeks. So those are new. And finally, data from the activity log. So, maybe things are happening. You've got the workload assigned to a certain way, and then things, maybe more paginated reports, for instance, are running and taking up a lot more resources than you expected. Things like that you can figure out from the activity log. But there's a lot involved with monitoring the health of premium. So kind of know that going in and be prepared to learn all the pieces and spend some time. So my suggestions are, and now I'm officially like 5 minutes behind schedule. So this is the last piece, and then we'll get to Q&A. So if you've had anything brewing, now is a really good time to start adding your questions to the chat window so that Bodan can read them out to me. But let's say you're just getting started. Just start capturing the audit log data. If you don't have it already, just start capturing it so that you can keep it. I want you to validate and document that your tenant settings are the way that you want them to be. And I want you to review and validate who your Power BI administrators are and make sure that that's the way you want them to be. And if your gateway server is currently a single node, that represents that single point of failure. So think about adding that second gateway server to make sure there wouldn't be a service interruption should something happen. Now let's say all those things are taken care of, you're good. Well, what's next? All right, well, how about some good analytical reporting for that activity log data? And then start augmenting that activity log data with security snapshots, Azure AD data, maybe even those gateway logs, start adding in other factors. I'd also encourage you to think about looking at things like, well, how are all of our workspaces and apps being used? And we really didn't spend a lot of time talking about this because this is more about deployment of content, but it can make such a big difference in not only user experience, but your administrative oversight as well. And do an end-to-end security review. So not just workspaces, right? But sharing and apps and data sets and all those pieces to see what's really happening. And then if you say, well, we're pretty mature, what should we tackle next? So let's start looking at where you can be more proactive. Things in the activity log that you can understand more and start acting early rather than being so reactive. And then maybe get involved with your governance and your support teams to get more involved with things like shared and certified data sets and make those more prevalent. And things like your data classifications, along with your data handling policies as well. And they're only effective if they can be managed and audited. So finally, watch the release plan, watch the Power BI blog, because both are super, super important so that you know what's coming, right? You've already heard me say a few times, we just got that in the last few weeks. So it's really important with the high pace of change to keep up and be really careful what you find online, especially bloggers. We have such a wonderful, vibrant community, but things get out of date. And finally, you kind of heard me say some semblance of all of these along the way, right? But your role is to help people get things done, not to say no. So focus on transparency and communication and all that kind of stuff. And try to be less reactive and try to understand the system as much as possible. And I know, I get it, there's real life. You're already working a bazillion hours a week and you're doing 18,000 things. So I do get that. The last thing I'll tell you before we turn it over to Q&A is a technical proof of concept with almost anything you haven't done before to verify your assumptions are correct. You know, there's that MVP type process where things mature. And I can't tell you how many times I thought one thing and then realized, oh, okay, there's something else. So get in the habit of doing technical POCs all the time. All right.
Excuse me, Melissa, 10 minutes
Yes, sir.
left. Oh, yeah.
Okay, I am ready.
So first of all, I would like to say thanks to Melissa for such a great presentation. And it seems to be we can have a Q&A session. So I saw a couple of questions. Bogdan, may I ask you to read them?
Yeah, so we have a lot of hello from people from Denmark, from the USA, etc. And so it looks like a lot of people are watching
Awesome.
this session. And so we have a few major questions. And I guess the first question is, what if you enable only certified data set for the tenant, but in some time visuals become out of certified state, yeah, and What about the reports that use certified data sets and the data sets, excuse me, not data sets. I think it's about certified visuals. Yeah, you mentioned about certified visuals enabled for the tenant here. And if people use certified visuals in their reports and after some time, the visuals are not certified already, yeah? What about the reports that use those certified visuals?
Yeah, so, I haven't run into this exact situation, but my assumption would be that if it disappeared from being certified, you could take that latest version and add it to your organizational visuals. And what I don't know, though, is if it'd have the exact same ID, because the problem is that it needs, when updates to a visuals happen, it needs to have that same ID so that the existing visuals on reports continue to work. So the question is, could you replace it in the organizational visuals without having to go touch all the existing reports? So yeah, sorry, I don't have 100% definitive one for you there.
Yes, thank you. And one more question about, can we get the URL for a Power BI activity log?
Well, there's not a URL for it because it's data in the a second here. It originates in the Microsoft 365 Unified Audit Log, right? But if you look right there, if you want to get it from a URL perspective, this would be where you'd go get it. And then you'd say down below in the filters, I only want Power BI data. The problem is that there's too many Power BI events to say, give me all of them from this user interface. It's too many. So this is only good if you say on an ad hoc basis, I want to see, for instance, who viewed Power BI dashboards in the last 7 days, right? That kind of thing. So it's only for like onesie twosie kind of things. So otherwise you really kind of need to use PowerShell and go get all the data, because this interface isn't good for just going to get all of it. However, the thing that's on the release plan, so basically their roadmap for these usage metrics right here, there is something on the release plan to improve this page. I will see what happens, right? And if that turns into being a URL where we can just easily download just the Power BI activity log data. My fingers are crossed that that's it. We just don't have it today.
Okay, great. And one more question from our users regarding the gateway management. Would you recommend business users to be allowed to add, remove data sources?
I think that depends on if they're trained and if, it's all audited. So I would say that if you can decentralize it like that, and sure, why not? But I wouldn't say that that's the norm. I would say that that's an exception because you have a certain segment of users that you say, hey, you can take this workload off of me, and we've instructed you in, how to do this.
Okay, and I see someone asked about the links at your first slide.
Yep, I'll put those back up there for you.
Move to it? Yeah. Yeah, so I don't know what particular was the most interested about those links, but I guess we would be able to share the presentation here, and anyone would be able.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's under, we're going in this way, community resources, under that menu, my presentation. So there's actually, so I put at the top, here's the PDF for what we just went through here. You also might be interested in, I'm going to update this one, this architecture end-to-end. I'm going to update this one here in the next couple of weeks because I have another session coming up. But another one that covers a lot of stuff that could be relevant that we just didn't have time to talk about today is this one about delivering and sharing content. And so this has been recently updated and has a video link as well. So there's multiple things on this page that you might find interesting.
Yeah, and oh, one more question, the new one. I have a self-service BI model, user authors and prepare data reports, but I want a corporate BI model. IT prepares data and users only consume. What will be the best approach to do so?
Well, you know, there's a lot to it, right? I think that very much depends on your current investment in, say, something like a central data warehouse. And if not, are you able to create some of those data sets in the Power BI service that those curated data sets that then can be made available for your various authors, your content authors to create reports from. So it takes a while to evolve to that middle column here, kind of where we started the whole conversation, right? The first column here is a common starting point, and it might be chaos and it might work well. It depends on your company and your user population. And the far right might be the starting point if you already have, say, a central data warehouse. And then whichever way you attack it, getting to the middle column takes a lot of work, but from your question, I guess I can infer that I agree that it's worth doing.
Thank you, Melissa. I guess that was the last question.
Unfortunately, this is all for today. Yeah.
Okay.
But hopefully we prepared for you a lot of interesting presentation and technically savvy speakers in the future session.
And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get all last news, live stream videos, and you can also join our community in the LinkedIn page. The link to the LinkedIn page is in the description of our video. So thank you, everyone.
Again, thank you, Melissa. Thank you all, and be smart and safe.
Thank
You
you.
too. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.